Welcome to Newshour. Well, it's been 5 months since Donald Trump returned to the White House, and if anyone thought his second term might usher in restraint, well, May has rather put that notion to bed. From courtrooms to foreign capitals, the president has seized headlines in a manner only he can. We've seen a major legal setback to his global tariff agenda, Elon Musk dramatically resigning from his cabinet, and a remarkable confrontation with South Africa's leader inside the Oval Office. Well, abroad, he's boasted of the $1 trillion investment pledges made during a Gulf tour, while back at home, the rhetoric turned inward with threats against Apple and an abrupt visa freeze for international students. Add to that a controversial executive order defunding public broadcasters NPR and PBS, and you begin to get a sense of just how much political weight this month has carried. Well, here with us in the studio is our US correspondent, Oubai Shahbandar, who's on assignment from Washington, and together we'll examine in no particular order what May tells us about the direction of Trump's presidency and why it's raising eyebrows well beyond American shores. Oubai, great to have you with us in the studio. Finally, let's get into this then straight away and start with the tariff saga. That federal ruling, how did it land Washington that the president's flagship policy was blocked in court? It must have been there must have been a lot of debate about this.
Yeah, look, this is 5 months where decades happen, you know, as the old saying goes, and this is a massive ruling against President Trump's flagship economic and trade policy program. Liberation Day, the president called it. So you now have 2 federal courts that have essentially ruled that the president does not have wide sweeping powers to issue executive orders that then launch these unprecedented tariffs on a number of countries, some of America's biggest trading partners. The Trump administration's response has been, well, this is merely a hiccup. The National Economic Council director has immediately pushed back, going on into the American media, saying that these are, quote, activist judges. And we've seen a number of these rulings against President Trump's agenda. He's barreling ahead with these executive orders, but a number of these federal judges are trying to put a halt.
And this appeals process, Albert, help us understand this a little bit better. Do you think it will genuinely threaten Trump's wider economic agenda?
Well, right now, the Trump administration is signaling that they're not going to stop, right? We're already seeing the negotiations. Well, I mean, this ruling took place in the midst of negotiations we saw between Washington and other, foreign capitals. We saw the president just as finalize a deal with China. But by the way, I mean, just merely hours ago, President Trump posted on Truth Social saying that the Chinese government is now reneging on the deal that he had negotiated with Beijing. So we may see a pullback back to those massive tariffs that the president had initially put on China, which essentially put a total stop on trade between the two countries. Now, the question is, what happens next? Okay, we have a system of checks and balances where the president has the executive authority to run foreign policy per the Constitution, but the Supreme Court and the judicial system also has a measure of oversight. So basically, the bottom line here is that this will now go to the Supreme Court, and it's unclear how the Supreme Court, even though there are majority conservative judges, whether they will rule in the favor of the president, and the fact that the office of the president, whether it's President Trump or another president in the future, will have the wide sweeping authority to issue massive tariffs on such short notice. This is a huge flagship for President Trump because, I mean, look, every day on the campaign trail, I remember, covering President Trump, he would say, my favorite word in the English dictionary, tariffs. So this is certainly a blow, but it doesn't seem that the President Trump's administration is going to be slowed down by it, given the signals that we're seeing from President Trump's senior economic advisors. Okay,
Oubai, we've got a lot to get through tonight. Let's move now to Elon Musk. But before we get into that, let's just remind viewers of the latest.
Elon Musk is leaving his role in government. A White House official confirmed the move late Wednesday, saying the billionaire's offboarding would begin the same night. The exit caps a tumultuous period since U.S. President Donald Trump returned to power, vowing to give Musk a big job.
And to that end, I have created the brand new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Perhaps you've heard of it, perhaps. Which is headed by Elon Musk, who is in the gallery tonight.
Musk set out to slash government spending, saying in March he could cut at least $1 trillion off federal expenditures.
If we don't do something about this deficit, the country's going bankrupt.
But DOGE attracted huge controversy, with critics saying it was making indiscriminate cuts that threatened vital services without even delivering the promised savings. Many were also angered by the resulting wave of job losses, with some 260,000 roles cut from the federal workforce. The controversy may also have done deep harm to some of Musk's businesses.
So, Oubai, a big impact, clearly, that Mr. Musk made, but then resigning, as we heard, just 5 months in. What should we read into that? What triggered the split?
Well, on one hand, you have Elon Musk and President Trump saying, well, Elon was a special government employee, and by the law, that only means that he can be in that position for so long. But look, let's face it, if there was a political will, or if there was a political decision to extend his stay as a special government employee, the office of the president would have that authority. So, but let's also look at the impact of what DOGE has had. On one hand, it is clear the White House more than likely views Elon Musk as more of a divisive figure. I mean, we saw Elon going to Wisconsin, trying to influence the local elections there for the Supreme Court of that state. That didn't go well. But he's also an entertaining figure, where so many rank and file Americans, your average Joe, love the fact that Elon, who's a billionaire, does not care what the establishment thinks. So he came in with a chainsaw. In fact, in one of his appearances, he actually brought an actual chainsaw, right? Where the Argentinian, it was a gimmick from the Argentinian president. But your taxpayer in America understands that the federal government is a massive machine, where it is by far the largest employer in the Washington, D.C. area. And many are saying, well, why do we have so many federal employees? Why do we have organizations like USAID funneling billions of dollars to NGOs that are pursuing policies that are not in line with American national security interests? And for the first time in the history of the federal government, a special institution was formed to cut the federal government. Now, whether or not he was successful or not, certainly the argument can be made that the initial projections of over $1 trillion in needless spending, wasteful spending would be cut. That certainly was not achieved. But that being said, usually the federal government increases in size every year, every administration, whether it's Republican and Democrats. What DOGE did was certainly unprecedented, and the American taxpayer wanted to see more of that. Now, there's a lot of political infighting as well. Elon Musk is a personality. He is, a force of his own, and that rankled a lot of feathers within Trump's cabinet.
How do you get on with the president? I mean, he's a very interesting personality, isn't he? We've spoken before on various shows about he's clearly an exceptional person. He's unlike any other president, unlike many other people.
For sure.
What do you think? Do you think that Mr. Musk leaving possibly might pave the way for others? We've not had too many fallouts just yet. Do you think there could be more coming?
Well, I would not be surprised. Look, President Trump, certainly he's learned his lessons from the first term. In the first term, many of the cabinet members, like his national security advisor and Secretary of Defense, were arguably working against President Trump's domestic and foreign policy agenda. This time around, he has Susie Wiles, he has a very capable chief of staff, and he has a cabinet from the Treasury Secretary to the Secretary of State to the Secretary of Defense to the Secretary of Commerce that are locked in step with President Trump's vision. And of course, Elon always made sure whenever these famous televised meetings of the cabinet, Elon Musk always made sure to give deference to President Trump. President Trump is a master marketer. He's a master politician. He understands retail politics. And he understood the value of having someone like Elon Musk from a broader political perspective, from a broader populist perspective. But look, without Elon, essentially there is no DOGE. But look at the impact. No USAID, billions of dollars of wasteful spending that was going to so-called non-governmental organizations. cut, but also a number of oversight boards that had an impact on Elon Musk's private sector work were also cut. So that also raised a lot of eyebrows. And look, let's also face it, Elon Musk, even Tesla, is still succeeding. The stock prices have increased. Many in the multitude of companies that Elon runs were saying, look, Elon, it's time to come back. Your work in the government is impacting the efficiency and effectiveness of your private sector work. Focus on going to Mars. You only have so much time in the day.
Well, I mean, another extraordinary event, Oubai, that happened this month was the clash in the Oval Office with Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president. It was extraordinary, and there were echoes of a previous clash with President Zelensky of Ukraine. What's your sense of the international reaction to that event in the time after it happened?
Look, President Trump, to put it bluntly, does not care. He knew exactly the plan was, we're going to show the American public that I, the American president, can bend foreign leaders to my will. And I'm going to do it in front of the entire world media. It wasn't just the American media that was there in the Oval Office, it was the international media and the South African media that was there as well. Everything was very carefully crafted for President Trump to really push the point that, hey, what you're doing in South Africa to the white African farmers, that is not right. That is a human right violation. And we as the United States are going to pursue policy that will give refuge to those South African farmers and ethnic Afrikaans. And that resonated a great deal with the broader American public. I mean, just looking at through social media and speaking to your average American, it really did have an impact. And look, the United States, as President Trump says, we're protected by two big, beautiful oceans. So it was very rare to see President Trump really focusing on such a moral issue of human rights violations happening in South Africa. But that certainly did have a domestic populist component to it as well. And everyone in the U.S., whether it's Democrat or Republican, loves to see the American leader in front of all the world's lights, all the media lights, put pressure in real time. I mean, when do you see this? And when have you ever seen this on another foreign leader? And of course, after the cameras went away, after the journalists went away, then the real discussions and negotiations take place behind closed doors. But look, let's face it, the corporate media in the United States was very harsh on President Trump following that meeting with the South African president. But sometimes you have to take extraordinary action to have extraordinary results.
It's very interesting because there was a real split in the analysis that I noticed. On the one hand, there's a point of view which says, of course, there's nothing wrong with standing up for your base, so the people that you've sworn to protect above all others, perfectly reasonable. On the other hand, there was a point of view which suggested that this was more than doing that. This was more of a sort of calculated culture war. And of course, when you assume such high office, you also have to some degree, align to those norms that go with that office. Otherwise, it can destabilize countries, economies, etc. Which one do you think is fairer, or is it somewhere in between?
Look, I think President Trump, if you tell him that, hey, you are jettisoning the norms of foreign policy and statecraft, he will say, yes, I am. And that has been really part of his style and method. And look, President Trump knows what endears him to not only his base, but the broader public. So I think we have an American president in the White House, in the Oval Office, that would be proud to say that, hey, I am not abiding by the norms of the establishment. Yes, maybe the Council of Foreign Relations does not like the style of my business, but hey, that's why I am president. And that is what's so unprecedented about President Trump's second term.
Okay, middle of the month, May 13th to 16th, the president jetted off for the Gulf, for the Middle East. And let's remind viewers of what happened on that last day in the UAE.
Donald Trump's Gulf tour took him to the United Arab Emirates on Thursday, and the visit was marked by the signing of more deals, valued in all at $200 billion. That followed a pledge by the UAE in March to invest some $1.4 trillion in the US over 10 years. Trump hailed that deal in a meeting with country President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan.
And all I could say is thank you very much. We will work very hard to deserve it.
Among the deals announced Thursday was another order for Boeing. UAE airline Etihad said it would buy 28 big jets from the aerospace giant, including 787s and 777s. That followed news of Boeing's biggest ever order for wide-body jets a day before, when Trump visited Qatar. Also finalised in Abu Dhabi was a plan for the largest AI campus outside the US to be built in the UAE. Reuters sources said the deal would give the country expanded access to AI chips from NVIDIA. Company boss Jensen Huang was seen conversing with Trump at the palace on Thursday. A White House fact sheet said other deals included a partnership between US and UAE oil firms to expand oil and gas production. It valued that agreement at $60 billion. However, US lawmakers, including Bernie Sanders, on Thursday sought to block further arms sales to the country. That's over allegations that UAE forces are involved in Sudan's civil war.
Okay, Oubai, the gold, the grand settings, the dramatic handshakes, and of course those very, very big numbers all look spectacularly positive. But in reality, how substantial are these pledges?
I think they're very substantial, particularly when you look at the defense deals and the multi-billion-dollar deal that was signed with Boeing, which means more American jobs. Look, it was very significant that you had President Trump's first foreign policy visit to be in the Middle East and the Arabian Gulf region, to Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha. That historical handshake in Riyadh between President Trump, Mohammed bin Salman, and the new Syrian leader Ahmed al-Shara with President Erdogan of Turkey calling in. That is the type of foreign policy moves that creates history, that makes history. And for many of President Trump's detractors saying, well, this is America first means American isolationism. Well, I think the president really proved them wrong. Look, but it's all about business, right? It's, President Trump's foreign policy paradigm is, let's make it a business relationship with countries, with international partners. And look, that's why Riyadh, each one of these countries, Riyadh, Doha, Abu Dhabi, they wanted to be the one that signed the bigger deal, the biggest deal with the United States. That's also because the US provides a level of security guarantees for these countries in the Arabian Gulf. The Al Udeid Air Base, one of the largest air bases in the world in Doha, the Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates, and a massive new American air base right outside of Riyadh, and of course the American anti-ballistic missile system that covers all of these countries. So President Trump wanted to see a return for his investments. Stargate, that massive AI project. In order to have all the processing power for AI, you need a significant amount of investment of energy and billions of dollars of financing, and that's where the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia and the Qatar Investment Authority and the Investment Authority of the United Arab Emirates are coming in to provide that liquidity. Very interesting to see Sam Altman, the nemesis of Elon Musk, on this trip. Elon Musk reportedly tried to get that deal with Sam Altman, and OpenAI killed. He wanted his own AI company, XAI, to be part of that deal, but that did not happen. And again, this is part of President Trump's, managing various members of his administration and his, supporting those on the inside and those on the outside, giving a significant amount of leeway for Sam Altman, who historically has supported Democratic leaders. But of course, at the end of the day, foreign investment into American companies means more American jobs. And we've seen the Trump administration really prioritize what they're calling the AI race. They want to make more supercomputers, more chips, that power AI compared to China. So this may be the new arms race, and the financing provided by these Arabian Gulf countries really goes a long ways in boosting American presence when it comes to the competitiveness in AI innovation. But this was massive. This was massive. All these countries, by the way, these Gulf countries that historically have not always worked together, essentially unifying with President Trump and providing billions of dollars of new arms deals to Washington. It's
interesting what you said a bit about the Sam Altman inclusion and Mr. Musk's feelings towards that. Is that a classic Trumpian tactic to have your lieutenants competing, battling with each other?
It's so classic. It was so classic. Look, Elon Musk truly hates Sam Altman. When President Trump was asked by the press in his trip to the region, hey, we noticed Sam Altman is there, and Elon Musk, who was sitting right behind the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman during the President Trump's speech. And what did the president say? Well, yeah, I have some hatred for people too. I understand. So it's
amazing though, isn't it? I think a lot of people that don't work in politics, don't work in diplomacy, would be amazed to hear that people consciously hire people they hate.
It's a level of political pragmatism. And look at Sam Altman himself, who had donated tens of millions of dollars to the Democratic Party's opposition, who had provided a significant amount of support to President Trump's political opponents. Now with President Trump in the White House, OpenAI knows that they need Washington on their side, and he's playing ball.
What's happening with the Gulf countries in the mind of Donald Trump? Obviously, they're cash-rich, they're energy-rich countries. There's a lot of investment happening. Anyone in their right mind would want to partner in some way with countries like that. But how does Mr. Trump think about it? Is there some sort of shift, economic shift, geographic, strategic shift going on in the way that he now wants to deal with those Gulf countries?
I think that relationship between the U.S. and these Gulf countries, when it comes to President Trump, is really also based on the personal leadership-to-leadership relationships that President Trump has built over the years. For example, with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is the future king of the Saudi Arabia. Excellent personal relationship between him and Trump, with Mohammed bin Zayed of Abu Dhabi, and with Prince Tamim, the young Prince Tamim of Qatar. Qatar working very closely with the United States on the negotiations with Hamas and Israel and other issues. And of course, so that, I think the fact that Trump sees eye to eye with these leaders who are young leaders who are going to be in power for decades to come has really shaped the nature of America's strategic partnership with these countries that have now become truly strategic allies of the United States. And that is, I think, if 20 years ago you'd have predicted that Washington is going to have perhaps almost as important of an alliance with the Arabian Gulf countries as with Europe, you would have been perhaps laughed out of the room, but here we are.
And there's quite an interesting dynamic with the Crown Prince in particular, in Saudi Arabia, that very often, I think, there's been a perception in Europe, in the West, of Saudi Arabia as being an ultra-conservative country. Many of the critics, the opponents of the Crown Prince, are actually in opposition to him because he's adopting more liberal policies. And actually, in that respect, do you think that he sees Donald Trump as a supporter, an ally to help him through that difficult process?
I mean, you can certainly see the spark of that relationship when President Trump was on stage in Riyadh with Mohammed bin Salman, when he was thanking Mohammed bin Salman, and the speech that Mohammed bin Salman gave recognizing President Trump's leadership. Look, I think it's significant that you now have an American president that is recognizing that you have fresh leadership in Saudi Arabia and in that region that are opening up culturally their countries, that are boldly pushing new reforms, and that are moving their countries into the next century. Okay,
let's talk tech now. Go to Apple, Tim Apple, as President Trump once called him. So that 25% tariff on iPhones made overseas, what's Trump's strategic aim here?
Well, Trump has always been saying this. He's always been saying, look, we need to bring the manufacturing sector back to the United States. And I don't mean out of China and into Vietnam and India, but we want it back to the US. Look, so this is a point of taking Trump at his word. Many pundits in Washington say, well, maybe he meant something else. But no, Trump's like, look, I meant it. I meant we need to bring back the industrial sector. We need to break the dependency of the supply chain that the United States has with components, high-tech components that are produced in China. Because what happens in case of an emergency? What happens in case of a conflict in the Pacific? We need to be prepared for that contingency. And yes, as President Trump said, that may lead to sticker shock, but we have to weather that storm. And it's very interesting. You don't often have American presidents telling the American consumer, the American voters, that yes, this may mean things may be more expensive, but we're going to have to bite the bullet. But hey, he only has one term left.
And linked to this, of course, as well, is Trump continuing to take aim at China, this time towards Chinese students, freezing of the visas. Let's get into this, but before we do, let's just take a look at the latest on this.
The United States has said it will begin revoking visas for some Chinese students. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on Wednesday the U.S. will, quote, aggressively revoke visas for Chinese students including those with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or studying in critical fields. That applies to a broad swath of the hundreds of thousands of Chinese university students in the U.S. While the number of Chinese students in the country has fallen in recent years, there were still some 250,000 studying there last year. The move could disrupt a major source of funding for U.S. universities, as well as a critical talent pipeline for U.S. tech companies. In a statement, Rubio said the State Department will revise visa criteria to enhance scrutiny of all future visa applications from China and Hong Kong. The Chinese embassy in Washington did not immediately respond to a request for comment. China is at the epicenter of Trump's global trade war, though Rubio's announcement comes despite a pause in the trade dispute. The administration of U.S. President Donald Trump has taken a number of recent steps as part of a hardline immigration agenda, including limiting new student visa applicants. It also revoked Harvard University's ability to enroll foreign students, many of whom are Chinese. The administration cited Harvard's ties to China as among several reasons why it took action. Those include long-standing research partnerships and China-focused academic centers. After Trump's move against Harvard, the Chinese Foreign Ministry vowed to, quote, firmly safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of its students overseas.
Okay, Oubai, give us an insight into the minds of the administration. What are they thinking here? And do you think it's possible this could backfire? I mean, these Ivy League brands are hugely popular overseas. Do you think there's a sense in which perhaps they could be going too far?
Well, we've heard Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying, essentially, encapsulating the policy of the administration that, hey, a student visa is a privilege, not a right. And certainly constitutionally, that is the case. And we've seen the Trump administration really put a focus on a battering ram on the Ivy League schools, particularly Harvard. Look, Harvard has a massive endowment, right? A $1 billion endowment. So the argument here from the Trump administration is essentially that these Ivy League schools and other engineering schools and tech schools throughout the country are just using these student visas as a cash cow to just raise even more funds while they're increasing tuition for the American students. So certainly from a domestic political standpoint, look, this move is not going to be unpopular by any means, and it also really raises serious questions. Okay, if you have such a massive endowment, and essentially a hedge fund by these Ivy League schools like Harvard, then why are you really so dependent on the massive amount of tuition that these international students bring in? And of course, there's the national security component, and that has been really a big factor in the Trump administration's move here to limit student visas, particularly when it comes to Chinese students in high-tech research facilities that are often connected to universities, because there have been many cases in the U.S. of espionage and of stealing intellectual property, where the students then go and take it back to China and back to the Chinese government. So it is both a part of the cultural war that the Trump administration is having with Ivy League schools like Harvard, but also there's that national security concern on, hey, are these international students coming from China? Are they really coming here to learn, or is this part of a broader nefarious plan to steal intellectual property and bringing back to their country? And
Oubai, another area where there may be this mix of culture war and legitimate concern is the aim the administration's taken at NPR and PBS, the public broadcasters, not just very big, widely dispersed broadcasting organisations, but also emblematic of a particular type of public service broadcaster. What's the thinking in taking aim at these organisations?
Well, part of it is cutting down, balancing the budget. But the other part of it is that, look, there is no love lost between President Trump and those of his administration with the individuals that run National Public Radio and PBS, with many in the Trump administration viewing these two entities as supposed to be providing a public service, but instead really essentially providing a sounding board for the left wing in the U.S. to attack the president. So that is the big concern from the White House is, hey, why are we paying you to attack us unfairly as part of the so-called liberal establishment?
So that is part of it, at least. Controlling the messaging is unashamedly part of that strategy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And look, it raises the question on can National Public Radio and PBS, can they raise money? I mean, look, you have CNN, you have Fox News. Why should the American taxpayer fund these corporate entities that are essentially not providing fair and balanced, viewpoint of the news and the coverage of politics in Washington. And that's certainly the viewpoint of the Trump administration. But look, going back to the cultural wars, look at who's the head of NPR, look at who's the head of PBS. Certainly there is, massive political divide of their worldview and that of President Trump. And it sends a message, again, to the American voter, to the American public, is like, hey, we're going to do away with these elites. This is part of the old way of doing business, of sending money to NGOs that support far-flung issues overseas, and we're going to cut the money to NPR and to PBS, and we're going to focus on America first. That seems to be the message. Always consistent.
Oubai, thank you so much for that whistle-stop tour. We appreciate it. You can take a break now. Thank you very much indeed. And so May draws to a close with President Trump firmly at the centre of the global stage, rewriting norms, unsettling allies, and rallying supporters with bold moves and sharp rhetoric. Whether these headlines point to strategic vision or raw disruption, the effects are rippling well beyond American borders. That is all for this edition of NewsHour. From all of us here at AnewZ, thanks for being with us, and see you next time.